It is almost 8:30 a.m. here in New Delhi. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets Asia. I'm Hazlinda Amin, and India is counting votes, with investors already sharing a third-term victory for Prime Minister Narendra Modi based on exit polls. Stocks are at record highs as we await today's open. Of course, this has been the longest and biggest election in history. We've had 7 phases over 44 days, and finally vote counting has begun. It's begun as we speak, and so far we have Modi and his alliance garnering about 93 seats, and that's based on those postal counts. At stake, 543 seats. Simple majority would do, and that's 272. If it's according to the exit polls, Modi and his alliance set to garner about 350 seats. Again, we have Modi wanting a supermajority. By that we mean 400 seats. He wants a supermajority so that he can push through what's seen as controversial reforms, the likes of land as well as labor reforms. Now, this is an economy that's been growing at about 8%, the fastest growing economy among G20 nations. We'll be bringing you the results from the count. For now, though, let's get you to markets in April. Of course, we're counting down to that open to Indian stock market. We've seen record highs for the Nifty in particular. Euphoria in the market. The question is really whether or not that is sustainable going forward.
Stock futures on the Nifty have fared in the past couple of minutes, raising gains of about 0.5% from earlier. And it seems like as these election trends emerge, investors are taking profit. Still, it was, all things considered, a really good day for India stock markets. We saw them, eking out those record highs on both the Sensex and the Nifty. So we're going to be keeping a really close watch on that. I'll take a closer look at the sectors that we will be monitoring later on. But just to walk you through what we're seeing in the broader Asia Pacific, it was a really lackluster session in the US among equities after weak US factory activity data, raising those concerns about recession. The US Treasuries really outperformed, and we saw that rise across the curve. So today we are seeing that reflected in the performance in the Asia Pacific, where stocks are pretty much struggling for direction. We're seeing bonds climbing as well. Even among the stock market in Japan that declined today, and we're keeping an extra close watch on it as we see those auto stocks on the back foot after Toyota's offices were raided. That's amid a safety scandal. So let's flip the board as well, take a look specifically at what we're watching in India. It was that record high, as I say, on the Sensex, on the Nifty, and I think by some estimates about $150 billion of market cap was added to India. These are the sectors that did really well. It was the infrastructure stocks. I think it was the best day for them in about 4 years. On the banks, best day in about 2 years. So these are, the kind of industries that we'll be watching very closely when those markets open later this hour, Haas.
That's right, those Adani Ambani related stocks, they have given a boost. Avril Hong, thank you so much for that update. So, India will announce election results Tuesday, with investors already cheering a third term for Prime Minister Narendra Modi based on exit polls, pushing stocks to a record high, as we had from April earlier. Let's get insights from Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic editor at The Hindu. Also joining us in this conversation is Bloomberg government reporter Sudhi Ranjan Sen. Thank you both for joining us. Suhasini, thank you for being with us today. What are you expecting, and will the real count reflect what we saw for the exit polls?
Well, certainly it's just a couple of hours away, because once the electronic voting machine counting begins, you have more than, I think, 15 million people sort of involved in the whole process. 64.2 million votes to be, 642 million votes to be counted. It happens pretty quickly. So by noon or by lunchtime, we do hope to have a real result as opposed to the exit polls. I think the exit polls threw up quite a few few surprises. Until the last poll of elections, no one was expecting the BJP and the NDA, the ruling NDA, to cross 300. But it seems from the exit polls that even 400 is not out of reach. So if the exit polls match up with the results that come out, it's certainly a startling win, because it's one thing to say you expect the ruling party to be re-elected, which I think most people would say. It's a question of the numbers, because they've certainly had a very tough campaign. We've certainly seen Prime Minister Modi react in ways we have not seen him do so before. Very tough rhetoric, very harsh rhetoric, often a rhetoric that really took on some of the country's minorities and other groups. So there was a sense that this was a particularly tough campaign. But if the results are as the exit polls say, it seems to denote that it's been a very successful campaign.
You got to wonder what's worked in Modi's favor, in BJP's favor. Is it because of his track record, growth at 8%? And he's lifted 250 million people out of poverty, according to some reports.
Well, you know, interestingly, each of the elections have had a different kind of theme. In 2014, when he came to power, it was an anti-corruption theme. He was getting out the old regime. In 2019, it was very much on the backs of a skirmish with Pakistan and the idea of national security being at the top of the agenda. This election was expected to have an emotional note. It was expected to be about the temple that Mr. Modi inaugurated in January. It was supposed to be about Hindu consolidation in many ways. In fact, the surprise has been that more people out in the campaigns have been speaking about the economy. They've been speaking about how the 8% growth doesn't necessarily trickle down, that it's essentially a jobless growth that we are seeing in India. The worries about not just unemployment, but about inflation, those have also been very much on top of the agenda. So why Mr. Modi would continue to win? I think the first is a sense of continuity. The second is the full domination of the ruling party in every sphere. So today, you know, we see the ruling party, in fact, has more candidates from the opposition who have moved to the ruling party than ever before. So if you were to see a super majority, as you called it, come through, India would see much more of a one-party domination across the entire country. And I think in that sense, there's always the idea that there isn't too much of a rival. There isn't too much of a single candidate who can take him on.
Let's talk about that, Sudhi. I mean, a single party domination, not necessarily a good thing for India. I mean, people have talked about how, you know, Modi may push through, you know, changes in the constitution, for instance.
Well, that's exactly what the opposition has been kind of focusing on. And given India's, you know, composition, it's very unique composition where you have, you know, castes, which is not there in any other country, and therefore the affirmative action. You know, the opposition's campaign we saw clearly focused, you know, saying that if the BJP and Prime Minister Modi gets the numbers that he is looking for, which is 3 out of every 4 seats in the parliament, then we really do not know what's going to happen to the constitution, what's going to happen to the affirmative action. So that's a message that the opposition and its various allied parties have tried to convey repeatedly and over and over and over again to the people. Whether that has stuck to people, whether that is making an impact, not yet clear. It's, of course, the results are going to be out, as Suhasini was saying, in a couple of hours. You know, then we're going to get a much more clearer picture on that. But yes, this is what is one of the apprehensions, that while Prime Minister Modi may try to push through some very controversial or difficult reforms, let me put it that way, like land reforms, labor reforms, which India may be needing to push the economy to grow beyond 8%, there are these other social aspects that these numbers are likely to give him. And that is where, you know, perhaps the big fight is going to be on the ground and will be clear as the results come out.
Right. Sudhi, talk to us about the opposition, right? If Modi and his alliance do get that supermajority, what does it say about the opposition? I mean, for the first time in quite a while, they've actually come together to work together instead of being so divisive.
Well, I mean, it is a question of survival for the opposition parties, and also therefore a larger question of the democracy in India, because no democracy can survive without a strong opposition, and so the results are going to kind of indicate whether, as Suhasini was talking about, whether India is going to go in for a one-party kind of a dominated rule for the next 5 years, or India is looking for a much more diverse parliament, and therefore different voices coming up, and therefore legislations, whatever they come, whether they are the controversial or the difficult ones or the easier ones, taking into account the concerns of people, of minority groups, on people who are not not present in large numbers. So at one level, it is the bigger question of India's democracy and the what kind of a strong opposition it has. On the other hand, it is also a question of survival, the relevance of the opposition in India. Yes, the opposition has come together after bickering we have seen over the last 10 years and several elections not being able to come together. But having said that, the opposition did suffer some very early blows. We saw one of the major partners or allies of the opposition kind of walk away and join the BJP, strengthening the hands of Prime Minister Modi in the very critical state, eastern Indian state of Bihar, which sends about 40 odd lawmakers to the parliament.
Right.
So there have been these ups and downs, but nonetheless they've put together a fight.
Suhasini, we talk about how a Modi win, it's almost guaranteed. It's just a matter of how strong that mandate is. What would the next 5 years mean in terms of policy if this is a Prime Minister who wants to achieve 9% growth?
Well, to be honest, I work on diplomacy much more, so let me talk a little bit about where we see this going a third term, particularly if in the first term we saw India move very decisively towards, say, Western powers, sign many foundational defense agreements with the United States. I think the second term has seen a little bit of a balancing. India going back to more traditional, non-aligned positions, particularly after the Russian war in Ukraine. We're seeing it very much right now in the Indo-Pacific as well. There's a little bit of a balancing. Remember, the Modi government has shown that India can be projected as a sweet spot in the world. It is not China, and therefore it does get a certain amount of interest from the world. And it is not in the Western camp. It is not an alliance partner. So it does get a lot of traction in the global South as well. And that's what I think you will see much more of, this balancing effect that the government wants to see India taking in the world. The second part is really going to be, and I think this is not something that's a choice, I think it's a necessity for the government right now to try and work out the situation with China. We've now had 4 years of the militaries of both sides, really eyeball to eyeball along a 3,500 kilometer line. Prime Minister Modi was asked in an interview, I think by Newsweek, about how he hoped to progress with China, and his answer was very simple. He said it's a very important relationship. The situation is of deep concern to me, and we need results. We need to resolve this situation very quickly. I expect there will be some kind of movement towards that once the government is in the saddle, if it is in fact Mr. Modi as is being predicted. The third place where I do see some movement is India in repairing relations with the neighbors. They seem to be a little frayed at the moment, particularly the Maldives. We're seeing situations where every country in this region is actually going to elections like so many countries in the world. So kind of, calming down post-political rhetoric on all sides, and then perhaps India will move in the region. There are a lot of trade deals that have been left pending in the last tenure of this government, and I think those will be a priority. The one with the UK in particular, although UK goes to election as well. The one with Canada has been put on pause because of the problems they're having over allegations that India was involved in an assassination there. And then there is the deal with Australia. A lot of these have to be put into place. They're reworking the ASEAN agreement, the free trade agreement, for example. A lot of these need to be put in place a little faster, I think, because RCEP is now in place. And finally, I think it'll be about projecting India, and the world will be watching, in terms of its own relationship with its democracy as a rule-abiding, pluralistic country.
We'll unpack some of the factors that you mentioned. Sudi, just to bring you back into this conversation, we talk about India's relations with China. Of course, it is complicated. And as much as there's tension, we've seen a lot of Chinese investments in India. How might this play out? How might the next 5 years be for India-China relations?
Well, to go back, I mean, on the India-China relationship, I kind of agree with what Suhasini was indicating and pointing out too, that there is going to be some kind of a rethink, because this, this kind of a relationship where you have thousands of soldiers, tanks, aircrafts, artillery guns, you're toe to toe on the border, 3,000 kilometer, more than 3,000 kilometer long border, is kind of untenable. On top of it, we've seen India kind of discouraging investments from China. If India wants to grow at a rate higher than 8%, then that money, that investment is going to be, very, very important for Indian industry. At the same point of time, there have been indications, the one that Suhasini was referring to, the Prime Minister telling Newsweek that it's a very important relationship. So exactly how that is going to happen, not clear. But from the past, what we can safely assume that this relationship can take a turn for the better, or we can see tempers calming down only if there is intervention from the political leadership and from the very top. We've seen, and there is precedence to it, that is the 2017 India-China conflict.
All right, Sudi, Bloomberg government reporter Sudi Ranjan Sen, thank you so much for that. And Suhasini Haidar will be staying with us for the hour as we wait for more updates from that vote count. Of course, you can also turn to your Bloomberg for more on this. Go to T-Live Go to get commentary. You can get analysis as well from our Bloomberg's expert editors. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back, and we're live from New Delhi where vote counting has begun. Of course, it's been a long election, and we're expecting results to be had in the next few hours. Of course, we've had in terms of the voters, we've had almost a billion eligible voters, so it's been quite a big one here. Elsewhere in the market, of course, it is still about the Fed front and center, and of course, treasuries in particular, treasury bulls losing their conviction. Avril Hong is on top of that. Avril.
Yeah, it's really interesting what we saw on U.S. Treasuries overnight after that factory activity data coming in weak, spurring bets that we're going to see those Fed rate cuts. And we're seeing in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, those bonds also following suit. Keep in mind that despite what we're seeing in Japan, overall, bond traders have been pretty bearish amid expectations of what the BOJ is going to do in terms of, reducing its bond purchases and coming through with those rate hikes potentially. We are seeing this climb in Japan bonds coming also ahead of an auction that is for the 10-year later this hour. Now let's flip the board and take a look at where exactly those U.S. Treasuries are sitting, because it was a move across the curves, 2s, 5s, 10s that climbed overnight, but we're seeing a bit of a pullback at the moment, Haas.
All right, a pullback. In terms of treasuries, the latest Bloomberg MLive Pulse survey indicating that treasury bulls are losing their conviction. Let's get more from Mary Nicola, who joins us from the Lion City. Results show that only a very narrow majority, 51% in fact, expects yields to fall in the next few months. Mary, take us through what the thoughts are out there.
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually to see the results of these pulse surveys, especially because you saw how just one month of data, when you see anything from the ISM coming out or when you see the PCE, obviously the market scales its expectations of what to expect from the Fed. You already had, for example, the September OIS curve is looking for almost a 70% chance of a Fed rate cut in September versus just a week ago we were just at just about 50%. So it is interesting that they're seeing that, their expectations are scaling back for the Fed, but then of course any data point that comes through just sways the market in the direction of keeping hopes of cuts alive.
Mary, I want to take you to where I am, the Indian market. What a run it had yesterday. Lots of questions of whether or not it is sustainable because a lot of people say, all the good factors have been priced in.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday we saw was an absolute relief rally because obviously it came under question whether Modi was going to win and how big was his majority going to be, especially with low voter turnout. Now that we've seen that the likelihood is for Modi to win, it comes to question of how big is that win going to be. And of course, the key thing here is that you want a majority so that you see some policy continuity, but the fear of a supermajority will weigh on sentiment in the sense of that the political agenda might overtake the economic agenda. And there's still a long way to go on the economic agenda front, where you have to keep up with pace in terms of growth. And so far, it has been performing well, but it's a matter of getting through a lot of key reforms, whether it's land reform or labor policy, and of course, maintaining and ensuring that there's an attraction for foreign direct investment, which has been lagging for quite some time over the last few years, and to bringing foreigners back, not only into the equity markets and the bond markets, but also to just establish an investment and a home in India.
Right, and for India itself, that income inequality front and center, as well as creation of jobs, Bloomberg's MLive strategies. Mary, Nicola, thank you so much for that. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. We're showing you the live picture outside the counting center in New Delhi. That voting count is underway. And if it's up to those exit polls, Modi and his alliance expected to get that 350 seats out of the 543 up for grabs. Let's continue our conversation with Suhasini. Thank you so much for still being with us. You talk about how it is important that India has those trade deals. What's the significance of those trade deals?
Well, I think the first is one of credibility. When the Modi government came to power, one of the first things they did is cancel all bilateral investment treaties because they wanted to build new ones. They were for many years quite against free trade agreements. They said they hadn't helped India at all. And especially when India walked out of the RCEP, Prime Minister Modi saying, this is not what Mahatma Gandhi would have wanted. However, we've seen a turnaround in the last few years. And so those trade deals are about credibility. They're also about bringing in investment.
All right, we'll leave it there. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Well, it's D-Day in India. Vote counting kicked off just about 30 minutes ago. And so far, what we know is that the BJP and its alliance have gotten about 93 seats. And that's from the postal votes. Of course, we're awaiting to hear more. We're expected to hear the results in the coming hours. Exit polls, again, suggesting that Modi and his alliance would get 350 votes. He is after 400 of supermajority, but that would mean Modi needs the support of, states which have traditionally voted for the opposition. For now, let's take a closer look at the Indian market. We have Avril Hong on top of that. Avril.
Yeah, Haas, we are waiting with bated breath the extent of the majority that the BJP-led alliance is going to get. But all things considered, it looks like we're going to see a Modi 3.0. That already yesterday is something that markets seem to have accounted for. And we saw that surge on those stock gauges, the Nifty, the Sensex, both rallying, seeing their best day in about 3 years to record highs. Today, we started off on the front foot on stock futures on the Nifty 50, rising about 0.5%, but it's erased quite a fair bit of that, actually slipping about 0.7% now. There seems to be a sense of how election trends emerging, potentially prompting a bit of profit taking. But of course, the sectors we're going to be keeping a really close watch on as the equity markets open in about 15 minutes from now are the infrastructure-related stocks and the ones in the Adani Group. Those were the ones that really outperformed yesterday. But we are also seeing that reaction in the rupee. Remember, flip the board. We saw it the second best performing currency in the Asia-Pacific yesterday, trailing behind the Korean won. And analysts have pointed out that against a backdrop of the elections, JP Morgan bond index inclusion that's coming up later this month, as well as lower oil prices. These are all factors that should lead to rupee appreciation. We're seeing some of the gains from yesterday actually coming off now. A dollar rupee trailing towards that 83.50 handle. There are some concerns as well about the direction of the currency as we have the RBI decision that is due on Friday. And there's a sense that when you look at monetary policy, it is in a pretty restrictive stage. It seems to be biting a little more, and there's the sense that the cooling inflation could actually lead to this climb in real rates and curtail growth. So this is among the things that we are keeping an eye on when we look at dollar rupee. Haas.
Well, that's right. It does seem like the stars are aligned for India. We have S&P, for instance, expected to upgrade its call on India's sovereign credit rating. Well, let's get more on India's vote counting efforts with our government reporter, Sudhi Ranjan Sen. Sudhi, earlier we talked about how relations between India and China are pretty crucial. How about other neighbors, the likes of Southeast Asian nations? Where are we with that, and where do we go with that?
Well, to begin with, there has to be, India needs to kind of take heed of the fact that several of the South, the neighbors, that is to say, countries like Nepal, has kind of, vented its anger in a way against India. Similarly, we have seen Maldives. Of course, Sri Lanka is one area where India seems to be very, comfortably poised after its role during the financial crisis in Sri Lanka. But that said, there is Pakistan as well, which is a close ally of China. And mind you, militarily, or if you look at it, the Indian military, so to say, is constantly kind of double guessing whether the kind of resources it needs to allocate for either of its borders. So that is one part. So therefore, what one can very clearly say, if there is a Modi third term, and with the numbers that as the exit polls have predicted, we can expect a reset of relations with many of these countries, and India could be taking a much more accommodative role, and as against its very shrill nationalistic role that we have seen it kind of projecting itself in the past. Exactly how that is going to happen, unclear, but also at the same point of time, it will be necessary for India to rebalance its relationship with its neighbors, because it's also trying to project itself or competing with China for being the leader of the global South. We have seen India kind of trying to project itself in the last G20, taking the concerns of the global South nations to G20, seeking reforms in the multilateral financial institutions, not only for itself, but on behalf of these other countries. So clearly, if there is a Modi third term, that is something that we can expect to happen and happen very quickly.
Sudhi, you got to wonder how comfortable the neighboring countries are with Modi wanting to be the leader of the global south.
Well, I mean, the global south, if you look at it, I don't see per se the neighboring countries having an objection to India playing a stronger, a more bigger role in the global south, provided their concerns, that of Bangladesh, that of Nepal, that of Bhutan, that of, are met, and met not substantially but wholesomely for these countries, because often we have seen some kind of an adversarial relationship or statements not so comforting coming out of the Indian Foreign Ministry. So all those, likely to change if there is a Modi third term. That rebalance we can definitely expect. Of course, at another level, we can also expect there's some kind of discussions or the relationship with China taking a turn for the better, not being so inimical, not being so hostile. How long that is going to take is going to depend on the numbers that the Prime Minister gets, the comfort he has in the Parliament. If he gets an overwhelming majority, of course, it's going to be faster. But if it is not that, then the China relationship, the improvement in the China relationship may take longer, because he's likely to face questions then from a much more stronger opposition in the Parliament.
Suhasini, let's talk about India's immediate neighbors. In the next 5 years, how much improvement do you think we'll see in that relationship?
Well, it's interesting, when Mr. Modi came to power in 2014, the first thing he did was invite all the neighboring countries' leaders to his swearing-in. The next time, it was a little smaller group. It was the BIMSTEC group that he invited. So all eyes firstly will be on who, if he does win the election, and if there's a swearing-in soon, who he will be inviting to that. Some have spoken about maybe further neighbors, like from the Gulf or from Central Asia coming in. When it comes to South Asia itself, it's a problem for India, because even as it pitches to the global, high table in a sense, unless it has neighboring countries on board with India's own growth, it becomes very difficult. So even small issues with countries like the Maldives, seeing the kind of growth Chinese companies have had in various parts of the region, become big issues in India. I think there will be a real pitch to smooth ties, at least, with countries like Bangladesh. We're expecting the Prime Minister here. Bhutan's Prime Minister expects to be here fairly soon. With Nepal as well, and Sri Lanka, we expect to see inroads fairly soon. I think after that, we'll see some of the other the Southeast Asian neighbors, for example, being reached out to. But immediately what's interesting is within a week, there's going to be the G7 summit in Italy. The Indian Prime Minister has been invited. If it is Prime Minister Modi, he's already indicated he's likely to go. Speaking to Prime Minister Maloney, next month there's an SCO summit in Kazakhstan, where President Putin, President Xi, the Pakistani Prime Minister, and others from the region will be there as well. Another very interesting point to watch. So I think the next few months, you will see a huge international outreach. Some of it is about consolidating Mr. Modi's position, or the Indian Prime Minister's position in the world. Some of it is going to be about, as I said, in looking for new areas of investment into India, because that's been a weak spot for the government. Singapore, of course, is India's biggest FDI source, but and since 2018, I think, but even so, 30% drop in last year's investment flows coming into India. So I think they want to certainly try to move that very quickly. We're expecting the inter-ministerial, the India-Singapore ministerial roundtable also to be held in the next few weeks.
Of course, with policy continuity expected, perhaps that reversal investments will be reversed. Of course, we'll get more on analysis as India counts the votes for its recently concluded election. Our government reporter, Sudhi Rajan Sen, was just with us. Now, here's a look at how it's looking for the Indian market as we cut down to the open. Of course, India saw its equities have a fantastic run. In fact, the Nifty surged more than 3% to a record high. We had the rupee also in positive territory. Still ahead, Edelweiss shares their outlook on India's elections and how the outcome could impact financial markets as well as the economy. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. And we're counting down to the Indian market open, and Avril Hong is on top of that. Avril, it does seem like we could see some profit taking after that surge in yesterday's trade.
Yeah, certainly. Remember those equity benchmarks that by some estimates helped to add about $150 billion to India market cap. It's really that optimism yesterday of policy continuity and clarity that drove the appetite for India stocks. And we saw them closing at record highs. Today, it looks like it's going to be a bit of a pullback. The Sensex about 0.2% down, but also keep in mind what we saw from yesterday's performance. We are seeing the rupee also losing some of the gains from yesterday, where it was closer towards the 83 handle, giving up some of that now. Now, I wanted to zero in on the stock market performance of some of the Adani Group stocks. Let's flip the board if we can and take a look at what we're seeing there, because it is really the infrastructure spending and the push in that sector that is expected as part of the policy agenda of the Modi government. If it gets this super majority, these are the group of stocks that are expected to really benefit. We have the likes of Citigroup and Jefferies saying manufacturing as well as EV stocks will also do well. Some extent of it might also go through into the renewable energy front. Yesterday, we saw a lot of the wind-related stocks rising by the daily limit. Remember, Modi had previously talked about how they want to make the country carbon neutral by 2070. So all these stocks are in focus, but you know how the Adani Group of companies seem to have, the closest alignment to the policy agenda of the Modi government. Yesterday, I think there was a swell of about $20 billion in terms of market cap of those companies. The power unit really led those gains. So these are what we're watching. We are also seeing, very interestingly, yesterday, the so-called Modi stocks, right? The index of about 50 of them, seen as the ones that will benefit the most from that policy continuity, they actually outpaced the gains in the Nifty 50, climbing about 6% versus what we saw on some of the gauges, the Sensex and the Nifty, about 3% gains. So it looks like a bit of that pullback that is underway in those stocks that really benefited yesterday, Haas.
And right now,
Avril Hong for that, and we have a headline here saying that India's early official vote count shows a wide lead for Modi allies. We'll bring you the details as they come along. Our next guest, though, is a prominent figure in India's financial sector and one of the most influential female voices on finance. Let's get to our guest. Radhika Gupta is CEO and MD of Edelweiss Mutual Fund, which has around $16 billion in assets under management. Radhika, talk to us about that rally which we saw yesterday. Seems to be giving up a little bit of those gains today. Is it just a matter of profit taking? How much more upside do we have for Indian equities?
The rally yesterday is not surprising. The capital markets in India have clearly wanted a political sense of stability and more over continuity in reforms. And with the incumbent government coming to power, as exit polls show, with a large majority, there's a belief that you will see policy stability and, in fact, maybe more bold reforms that India needs, given the growth that we're seeing. So I think yesterday's rally is exactly what financial markets, would have wanted. I wouldn't make too much of today's cuts because early numbers have come in as far as actual poll results. I think we'll get a clearer picture closer to noon. I do believe if the number for the NDA government is closer to 400, markets will be happy. If it's not, you might see some cuts. But if the exit polls, do translate into reality, and we'll get that sense by noon, I think this picture could change a little bit.
But Radhika, you got to wonder how important that margin is. After all, Modi is set to still be in power. Policy continuity is set to take place. I mean, isn't there already confidence that we'll see more of the same?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, and to some extent, I think I would go as far as to say over the last few months, Indian markets have rallied and factored in perhaps policy continuity. The only thing is that, if you have a large mandate coming in, then some of the reforms that this government has talked about, particularly bold reforms around land, labor, which are expected because Mr. Modi has talked about India becoming a major manufacturing hub, you have the ability to take on some of the bolder reforms that have been talked about in the last couple of months and year. So I think that's what the market could look forward to.
How would you position your portfolio?
So I don't. I think India will see a broad-based market rally. I don't buy the thesis that a portfolio should be positioned for particular sectors. Now, within this, however, historically, I think India's leadership has been driven by services. I do believe that I would position a portfolio with a tilt towards manufacturing. So that means things like industrials, that means sectors like capital goods, anything that's a beneficiary of private sector capital expenditure coming into the markets. I do believe selective themes where the government has intended to focus, defense, for instance, and there's been a large indigenization of defense that India has been working on, already doing about $3 billion in defense exports. So some of those segments, electric vehicles, because the government has talked about, moving the grid to electric. So some of those themes will be satellite parts of the portfolio, but definitely a focus on the investment and manufacturing side of the economy. And as we build India portfolios, a more domestically biased portfolio rather than sectors that are very globally linked.
What's the biggest risk for Indian investors right now, Radhika? And what assumptions are you making about when the RBI might come into play, when that rate cut might come?
So I think, it's tricky to make assumptions, but I think the rate cut, I think you're going to see a period of stable rates. Inflation in India is not out of whack, so that is the good news. But I think the RBI is going to be more cautious than one expects. I think the biggest risk is pieces of overvaluation in some segments. I think on a broad basis, the Indian market is not cheap. Growth is certainly meaningful, and I think continuity in policy and continuity in government will attract global investors who have largely stayed on the sidelines while looking at India with a lot of interest. So I think you're going to see more global capital come in post, an election outcome, a favorable election outcome. I do think parts of the market, small and mid caps, one has to be thoughtful about the kind of valuations that one is paying. So I think one has to be selective in their stock picking there.
We know how India has benefited from investors looking for an alternative to China. A lot of foreign money has been gravitating towards the market here. But now with China showing some signs of recovery, might that money flow revert back to Beijing?
I think, and I attend a number of conferences. I mean, I was at Milken a month ago, and India versus China was a question mark. I don't think India is China plus one. I think India is a narrative of its own, and it's a growth model that is perhaps more similar to the US of the 80s than what China is. So I think global investors are now starting to see that there are differences between the India and China model. As I see China, it's the world's second largest economy. Valuations are certainly more favorable than India, but uncertainty factors are significantly higher than India. I think with India, you've got a steady base of continuity and growth momentum. So I see one as a turnaround and one as a sustained winner. Of course, valuations are very different. So I think investors honestly, have very, very different viewpoints on how to look at India and China, but I don't think India is China plus one.
Radhika, thank you so much for your insights today. Radhika Gupta, CEO and MD of Edelweiss Mutual Fund. Let's do a check on how Indian markets are doing. Of course, just early days yet. We've seen, of course, the run-up in the stock market yesterday, up more than 3% today. Perhaps some profit-taking. We're pretty much seeing red across the board. The Nifty down the most since March. The Sensex down the most since January. Of course, as Radhika mentioned, she expects the run-up in Indian stocks to persist with policy continuity if Modi comes back to power for another 5 years. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Let's take stock of where things stand in India with vote counting now well underway. Suhasini, it's interesting, right? I mean, I just read a headline saying that the Modi and his alliance are way ahead, but some other reports suggesting that perhaps the opposition is putting up a very good fight, and hence we're seeing that the market reacting to it.
Yeah, at the end of the day, nobody doubts that the ruling party is in the best position to come back to power. But even now, what you mentioned, right now, a difference of about 70-75 between the two seats right now does indicate that there is a fight. Whether this is early trends or whether that sustains through to the afternoon will be interesting. But so far, what we're seeing of the trends are not actually matching up with the exit polls, which gave the markets such a big bump on Monday.
But some people say that the opposition did indeed put up a good fight this time around. Unlike previous elections, they came together, worked together, made sure that they had candidates in the different states.
I think that's definitely true. I also think there is no complacency in the opposition this time. There is a sense that there is a fight to be fought for Indian votes. And there's been a very sort of quick time responses to Prime Minister Modi's statements. We're also seeing today in the counting booths, letters have gone out to the opposition members to say, please be at your counting booth till the end. Do not move. If you see anything going awry or you think there's some kind of trouble over counting, please send out videos, get in touch. So there's a proof of life, if you like, whereas in the past, we've sort of taken it for granted that the opposition will not really cohese together.
So what are the chances that perhaps the exit polls were wrong and that perhaps the opposition is right in thinking it can get 292?
Well, exit polls in India are not like exit polls in other parts of the world in terms of they're done by different parties, they're done by different television channels. Often television channels take party exit polls as well. So it's not necessary that they're accurate. But the general trend, if that were to change, that would be a big surprise.
All right, Suhasini Hardar, diplomatic editor with The Hindu. Thank you so much for your time today. That is it. From Bloomberg Markets Asia, we'll continue our coverage of the Indian election, the Indian count. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.